Hi, today I am going to speak about Spring Framework core module. Spring make it easy to create Java enterprise applications. Spring Framework is divided into modules. Applications can choose which module they need. Core module provides inversion of control. When Spring Container creates a bean instance, it assigns the dependencies mentioned through constructor arguments or properties or as arguments to a factory. The process of assigning dependencies to a bean instance is called dependency injection. Instead of being locating the dependency and creating its instance, it is done by Spring Container, hence the name inversion of control. While creating instances of a class, we may need to supply some initial values to the constructor. These values can be considered as dependencies for the instance which gets created. We just have to call the getBean method on the application context object with the bean name and bean class type. This makes the code configurable and reduce tight coupling. There are many scenarios where we may need to pass different dependencies at different places. We may need to pass different subclass instances. All these scenarios can be handled through Spring Framework. Spring IOC container. It is responsible for creating the bean instances with its dependencies injected into those instances. org.springframework.beans and org.springframework.context are the basics for the Spring Framework's IOC container. org.springframework.beans.factory.bean factory interface provides advanced configuration mechanisms capable of managing any type of object. org.springframework.context.application context is responsible for instantiating, configuring, and assembling the beans by reading configuration metadata. The objects that form the backbone of the application and that are managed by Spring IOC's container are called beans. Beans and its dependencies are reflected in the configuration metadata used by a container. There are several implementations of application context, mostly in standalone applications. We create instances of org.springframework.context.support.classpath.xml application context, providing XML configuration of beans definition. There are many implementations of application context such as annotation config application context etc. Auto-void annotation. Auto-void annotations are used to mark dependencies of an instance. Every time in code where a bean is required, we do not have to select the bean passing its name or type from the application context. We can just use auto-void annotation in the field level, setter method or constructor method. When a bean for any auto-void variable cannot be found or if more than one bean is found for the same type, then resolution fails. Later issues can be solved if we annotate list or array fields with auto-void annotations. Then all matching beans are collected in the list. It can also be solved using qualifier annotation or including primary annotation. In auto-void annotation, we pass required equal to false to skip the dependency if dependency cannot be resolved. Otherwise, exception is thrown. In a class, we can use only one constructor with auto-void annotation with required equal to true. We can have many auto-void annotation with required equal to false. In the later case, the constructor with the maximum number of resolved dependencies is selected. In bean definition, we can enable or disable auto discovery of the bean. Qualifier. It can be used to group components based on aspects. While creating bean definitions, we can specify qualifiers so that dependency can be specifically located by the dependent bean. Profile annotation can be used to include components conditionally. For components that must be included conditionally can be provided with profile annotation with a list of profile names. According to the active profile list, components will be included. To set active profiles, we use environmental variable or Java system arguments, or we can set them programmatically, or it can be set using active profile annotation. When we set programmatically, we have to refresh the context after setting to take effect. Value for profile annotations can be provided with logical operators. We can use logical not, logical and logical or conditions. We have to provide parentheses for complex conditions as logical and logical or operators have the same priority. If there are many beans of same type, the one which is set as primary will be used. Fallback can be used to demarcate the other beans other than regular beans to be injected. If only one regular bean is left, then it is a primary bean. Scopes. There are two scopes available. They are prototype and singleton. If a bean is assigned a singleton scope, then only one instance of the bean is created and maintained in a cache. The one instance is maintained in the container lifecycle. If a bean is assigned a prototype scope, every time a new instance is created whenever this bean instance is requested. There are also other scopes, but that applies only when we use web-based application context. Component scanning. Candidate components are classes annotated with component annotation and are implicitly detected by scanning the class path. Instead of manually adding every bean definition, we can let Spring add bean definitions automatically through class path scanning by providing the base package name. We can use filters that ensure only required components are detected. We can use either include filters or exclude filters to include or exclude some components. There are many types of filters available such as annotation, assignable, aspect J, regex and custom. The most used filter is annotation and that is default type. If annotation filter type is used, only classes with specific annotation type at the type level are considered. Class path scanning can also be done programmatically using the scan method in annotation config application context. When the scan is performed programmatically, we have to call the reference method in application context. Spring's IOC container decoupled from the format in which configuration metadata is written. Configuration metadata can be provided as annotation configuration, Java configuration, and XML configuration. Bean definitions can be provided as an XML file. Now consider the class student service and student DAO. Student service requires a reference to student DAO and it has a student name property that needs to be assigned during instantiation. It has a method that prints a hello message and calls the DAO method to get the number of unread messages and prints a status message. Database calls are implemented in DAO classes, but here a dummy value is returned. Now, this is the driver method. It first creates the application context instance by passing the bean definition XML file and retrieves the bean from that instance. For instantiating containers, we have provided a full path to XML configuration. Here, we can provide a list of configuration files. This is the bean XML file that is passed while creating object for application context. Here, ID attribute is a string that identifies bean definition. It should be a unique value. Class attribute defines bean class and it is fully qualified class name. Here, bean configuration can mention the fully qualified class name of a bean for which instance has to be created, or it can specify class name and static factory method. If the factory method is provided, then factory method is used to fetch the bean instance. It is not necessary that the factory method should return its class or subclass instance. It can return any instance. The factory method can also be non-static for which we have to use factory-bean attribute and factory-method attribute. Constructor-arg can be used to provide values to the constructor arguments. The values are applied in the order the constructor arguments are mentioned in bean definition. We can also use the order attribute to specify the order. We can also mention the instance variable name to which value has to be assigned. Property elements are used to provide values to the object instance once instantiated. Name attribute refer to the instance variable name and value is assigned to the variable. Here, value can be primitive value or reference to another bean instance. For primitive value, we use the value attribute and for bean instance, we use ref attribute. Ref attribute is used to refer to the other bean definition. Type attribute can be used to specify the type of variable. Spring also support collection types such as list, map, set properties. Overriding bean definition is possible. For example, consider the mock implementation for the student DAO class, which we have seen earlier, which has one property cache to store the data and it has one corresponding setter method. It overrides the get 100 messages count and get messages method and returns the count from the cache. This mock is created for testing the application. Now, to override a bean definition, just declare another bean definition with the same name. For example, here the student service bean definition in test.xml file overrides the definition in parent XML file and assigns the reference of student DAO marked to the dependency. Import tag can be used to import another bean definition into this definition. We can use abstract bean definition to reduce code repetition. For abstract bean definition, class attribute is not required. Here, MySQL data source and Oracle data source bean extends from the abstract data source bean. It has some properties and it also overrides some properties specific to the bean. Merging bean property values. When we are extending from the abstract bean definition, we can also merge the collection values. For merging, we have to include merge equal to true attribute in the collection property in the extended bean definition, otherwise value will be overridden. Merge is performed according to the collection. For list type, Order is maintained, parent list elements will be placed first and child elements are placed. For other collections, order is not maintained. For map and properties type, if the same key is used in the child, then the value for that particular key will be overridden. Component scanning can be enabled in XML configuration to mix XML configuration with annotation based configuration. Filters can be specified using context colon include hyphen filters tag and context colon exclude hyphen filters tag. Context colon component scan tag can be used to enable component scanning. Scopes can be assigned using the scope attribute in the bean tag. Qualifiers can be added to the bean definition using qualifier tag. Primary equal to true attribute can be used to mark the bean as primary. Profiles can be mentioned in the profiles attribute in the bean tag. Autowire hyphen candidate attribute in bean tag can be used to configure auto discovery of the bean. Annotation based configuration. It operates on metadata in the component class itself provided by some annotations. Thus, bean definitions are extracted from class annotations. Component annotation on a class indicates that it is a bean. Spring provides three more annotations: repository, service, and controller, which are specializations of component annotation for more specific use cases in persistence, service, and presentation layers respectively. org.springframework.stereotype.component annotation indicates that the annotated class is a component and makes the class eligible for class path scanning. A component can specify a logical name via the value attribute. org.springframework.stereotype.repository annotation is annotated with component annotation. Indicates that the annotated class is a repository. This annotation is mostly used in data access objects. org.springframework.stereotype.service annotation indicates that the annotated class is a service. Mostly the facade classes uses this annotation. org.springframework.stereotype.controller annotation indicates that the annotated class is a controller. These classes mostly have handler methods based on request mapping annotation. For example, we have three components. They are employee, human resource, and manager annotated with component annotation. We have one service which is employee service annotated with service annotation. We have one configuration class annotated with configuration annotation and component scan annotation and value for base package attribute is provided. This class with the main method is the driver. For component scan, we have to create a class with configuration annotation and component scan annotation. In component scan annotation, we have to pass a value for base packages variable. Filters can be specified in component scan annotation. Scope can be given using scope annotation and passing necessary scope name. Qualifier annotation can be used along with component annotation. In the receiving side, qualifier can be used at field level, method level, or method argument level. Primary annotation can be used to mark a component as primary. These are the qualifier annotation that are used at the receiving side. Profile annotation can be mentioned at the component class level. Annotation config application context can be used to instantiate the application context by passing the list of component classes. Java configuration. Java configuration uses configuration annotation and bean annotation. Let's use the previous example and we will see how to create the same in Java configuration. We can remove all the annotations in the component and service classes: employee, human resource, manager, and employee service. Scope can be given using scope annotation and passing necessary scope name. Qualifier can be used along with bean annotation to provide qualifier configuration. In the bean annotation, we can set the boolean variable autowire candidate to configure the bean auto discovery. If we set default candidate equal to true, it is equivalent to marking a component class with primary annotation in annotation based configuration. Profile can be configured along with bean annotation. Same annotation config application context class can be used to create an instance of application context. Thanks. If you find this video valuable, you may share with others. If there are mistakes, please mention them in the comment section.